Good morning, everyone, and happy Hump Day. This is Karina Hill with the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, and I wanted to thank you for joining us today and also thank you for everything that you do in our lives to make a difference. We are going to start our webinar in a few minutes on compassion fatigue, additional risks while serving vulnerable populations during a crisis with Susie Kowalski. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and myself by using the chat or the Q&A panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. Please use the chat or Q&A panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them, and the presenter will address them as time permits. One thing I did want to say is whenever you do send us a question or a comment, please make sure that you select to all panelists and not just to the host privately so that the presenter also sees your comments. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options are posted in the chat panel too. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, you may want to try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and be able to view it on screen to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADA website within 30 business days. We do try to have it up there quicker if possible, but we ask that you be patient because sometimes it does take up to 30 business days. One helpful hint is the archive video displays what looks like to be an error message, but it's only a delay buffer, so you can just ignore it, hit play, and enjoy. To access the recording and PowerPoint, you will go to our website, www.fada.org, and check out the training library and the resource center. FADA produces many webinars and workshops through support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FADA website. You will first need to register or sign into your account to complete the evaluation. If you do not receive that link, it's probably because you have not created a profile and you will need to go to our site to create one at that time. The information that you provide FADA as part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 30 business days, and that's after the evaluation closes. And they are posted in your individual professional development journals for persons that complete the evaluation and attend the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Please note that the evaluation will close on Monday, August the 17th at midnight. 1 to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license number for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. Please note that WebEx does monitor your arrival and departure, and it also provides us a report upon completion of the event. It is very important that you attend the entire webinar. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar. Again, we are not permitted to give partial credit. And now I'd like to welcome our presenter, Susie. And she has been serving with stigmatized communities for more than a decade through direct clinical practice, as well as by delivering training and consultation to students, service providers, and administrators. Susie has worked in community mental health organizations in Chicago to develop and implement new programs combining her clinical expertise with administrative and organizational skills to launch trauma-informed programs based on principles of harm reduction. Susie applies her experiences as an outreach worker, substance use counselor, trauma therapist, clinical supervisor, and program manager to develop trainings for a broad range of workers with different roles, experience, and expertise. As a therapist, clinical supervisor, trainer, and consultant, Susie emphasizes a relational approach in which healthy connections facilitates the development of insight, practice of new skills, and curiosity for continued growth. And with that being said, Susie, I'd like to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you. Susie?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karina, for that warm introduction and for all of your work to bring this webinar together. I want to thank FADA and the Florida Department of Children and Families for bringing me in to conduct this webinar. And for those of you who are tuning in, I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy week to join us this morning. I know this is a very timely webinar, so I'm really looking forward to sharing this material with you today. As Karina said, my name is Susie Kowalski, and here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me after this session if you have any other questions or comments. It's always nice to hear from folks, and I'm really happy to be available as a resource to anyone doing this really important work. I want to share a little bit about my background. As Karina said, I've been working with vulnerable populations for more than a decade, and I truly love this work, but I also know that it affects me, and not just on a personal level, but also on a professional level, or either way. It affects me in both ways. And I'm definitely someone who has struggled with vicarious trauma at times, and I've experimented with some ways to manage it that have worked well for me. And I've also tried some ways to manage it that haven't worked so well. I know we talk in this field a lot about the importance of self-care, but I think we often feel a little bit lost or kind of on our own when it comes to, like, how do we actually take care of ourselves in terms of how the work affects us? And in particular, how do we do that in the context of a global crisis? So these are complicated and complex questions without clear-cut or simple answers. So I present this material today not because I have absolute mastery over it or the best answers and certainly not quick solutions, but I'm talking about this today because I wholeheartedly believe it to be a really important conversation to have. And I want to give this some good airtime so that we all have the space to think about these things and consider what this looks like for each of us and come up with some ideas of how we can approach our work moving forward. As we begin to dive in here as a starting point, I want to say that my hope is that this will be a conversation that continues well after we leave this virtual room. Within the next 2 hours, we're not going to have a perfectly clear sense of our own level of compassion fatigue and then a rock-solid plan for managing it. But we should have some tools and ideas to help us wrap our heads around what's going on for us at work, particularly right now, and then a framework for how we want to move forward from here. So we'll start out by talking about some of the different ways that working with vulnerable populations can increase our risk factors for compassion fatigue. Then we'll look at how we can assess the impact of compassion fatigue at both the individual and organizational levels. And we'll wrap up by talking through different strategies to reduce our risk and build resilience, again, at both the individual level as well as the organizational level. Throughout our time today, I would also really encourage you to reflect on your own experiences, tune in to your responses and reactions as we work through the material, and to really notice yourself with as much curiosity and compassion and openness as you can. I've put together these slides, and I think it's helpful to have some cognitive understanding of these concepts, but compassion fatigue isn't something that exists on paper or that we can effectively manage by reading about it. It's something that's personal and experiential, so I think this will be more meaningful for you if you bring your own experiences to this space. So with that in mind, let's get started. I wanted to begin by hearing from all of you. What brings you to this work? If you think about kind of when you were just starting in this field, what brought you to this type of work? And then also, what kind of messages do you tell yourself or have you heard about what it means to do this kind of work? So if you can go ahead and enter your responses into the chat, I'm really curious to hear from you all about these things. Yes, so wanting to help people, feeling like we could change the world. So some personal experience with family overdose from substance use disorder and mental health, or someone's own experience with abuse as a child. Having received some therapy and mental health support yourself and feeling like that really made a difference. The challenge of helping others. And so thank you all for these responses. This is amazing. If you can add in also, as Terry Allen did, what kind of messages do you hear about what it means to do this kind of work? So for example, back when we could meet people in social gatherings and someone asks, so what do you do for a living? And you tell them, what kind of responses do you get, or what sort of things have you sort of internalized about what it means to be a worker in this field? Watch out for burnout, absolutely. Thinking about our own trauma and wanting to help others. Compassion fatigue, representing underserved populations. Yes, that this work gives us a sense of purpose and a positive impact. People say things like, wow, well, we need you. Keep doing what you're doing. That's a great response. Oh, that has to be hard. I get that one a lot. You won't make a lot of money in this field, so you're not wrong. It must be difficult. That work sounds so heavy. I don't know if I could do that. Must be challenging. Thank you all. These, oh my goodness, this is really incredible to hear from all of you. Bless your heart. I couldn't do that. You have to learn to take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. That is definitely one we hear. And so I'm curious for you all, when you hear these types of messages about the difficulties and the rewards of our field, are those things that you embrace and identify with, or are those messages that you kind of rally against and feel like I don't want to become identified with those beliefs? Yeah, so we rally against the negative ones, but I appreciate Judith Wiggins mentioning I don't feel like a saint, right? We're still human. Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. And as Cynthia mentions, we see it sometimes happening with our supervisors or other people who've been in the field longer than us or may have a different experience. That it's a little bit of both, as you all are doing such a great job of really explaining. Is we love and definitely acknowledge the benefits of our field. And there are some negative messages about what it means to work in this profession that to some degree we definitely rally against as a way to sustain ourselves and be able to sort of form our own experiences. But at the same time, there's things that we're aware are part of our field for a reason, and that comes from somewhere. So I'm going to move on, but thank you all so much for sharing this. One of the things that I have found the more I've done trainings on vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue is I've discovered that people really have such a hunger to have a place where they can discuss what the work means to them and how it affects them. So I'm glad we're going to have some time today to kind of dive into that. So I love this quote by Dr. Rachel Remen. It comes from her book, Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories That Heal. And she says, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So as you all did such a great job of pointing out, we didn't come to this work with the expectation that we wouldn't see or encounter difficult situations. Very often that's actually what drew us in. And so we know that it's inevitable that we'll be impacted by the work. It's not a matter of being a good enough counselor or having enough experience or enough resources or being tough enough. It's a non-negotiable element of this kind of work. Let's talk through some of the different terms that we use to describe the ways that work affects us. Looking at this list, I think a lot of folks identify with some of these terms, but aren't entirely sure how to define them. So we'll go through a brief overview here and then dive a little bit deeper into these different concepts and look at how these show up in our work in particular. I think all of us have had plenty of times when we feel stressed. But what exactly is stress? Like, how would you define it? It is actually defined as a reaction to a stimulus that disturbs our physical or mental equilibrium. And we'll talk a little bit more about stress on the next slide, but I think it's important to remember that stress can be both positive or negative. It isn't necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes we think of it as being only a negative thing. Traumatic stress refers to high-intensity situations that include our perception that our life or safety is at risk and which overwhelms our ability to cope. Our body and brain have a set of responses that traumatic stress brings on, which are meant to protect us and actually do a really good job of keeping us safe. Our heart races, blood pumps to our extremities so that we can run really quickly. We become less verbal, and that's because typically talking is not very likely to save our life from that kind of a threat. And our fight, flight, or freeze response kicks in. So after we experience traumatic stress, we can have a range of different reactions, both immediately as well as over time. And that's what we refer to as post-traumatic stress, a very specific type of stress that comes after a traumatic event has ended. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a very specific mental health condition. The DSM identifies specific symptoms that individuals have to experience in order to meet criteria for PTSD. So we'll look at those symptoms a little more closely later on, but what's important to know is that even when people don't meet full criteria to be diagnosed with PTSD, they can and very often do experience some of those symptoms. Burnout is something that we hear about a lot in this field, as you all alluded to. and it refers to a state of exhaustion caused by long-term involvement in demanding situations, which I'm sure sounds familiar. But a key element of burnout is that it's something that takes place over time. When people are burned out, they can experience depression, cynicism, boredom, discouragement, and people in any profession can and do experience burnout. It's something that's not unique to our field. What I think does distinguish our profession from so many others is the amount of emotional labor that our jobs require. So, for example, accountants can experience exhaustion and burnout from long hours and stressful conditions, I'm sure especially during tax season. But the nature of their job, as I understand it, doesn't involve a lot of emotional investment. It takes a different type of energy to manage emotional content. And I don't think there's always a lot of recognition around that, in part because I think in our culture we don't prioritize emotional intelligence or nurturing or growth in the same way that some other cultures do, and that adds to the weight of our list. It's also really hard to explain to someone why it's so exhausting to sit in a chair all day and listen to people. But all of us know that it definitely is laborious and it takes a toll. So we just want to start by at least stating and acknowledging that. Compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is really closely related to the emotional labor that our jobs require. So it's kind of referring to the combination of the physical, emotional, and spiritual depletion that comes from caring for folks who are experiencing emotional pain and physical stress. And very often, our compassion and desire to help other people, as you all stated, is what draws so many of us to this field. And compassion fatigue is really just what the phrase indicates, that our compassion is tired and worn out. Now, trauma doesn't have to be present in order for us to experience compassion fatigue, which is part of what distinguishes it from vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma is the response of someone who is exposed to traumatic material, but who doesn't directly experience the trauma themselves. So if I'm working with someone to process their childhood abuse and the way that it relates to their current substance use, even if that didn't happen to me, my exposure to it, hearing the details of it, that can create in me some of the same types of responses that someone who directly experienced the abuse might have. So vicarious traumatization is an occupational hazard for us and for really anyone working or volunteering in fields where they're exposed to traumatic or violent material. So definitely that includes us, but also people like first responders, folks working in victim services, medical providers, and any kind of job where part of your work includes exposure to trauma or working with people who've experienced it. I want to add in that sometimes we hear the term secondary traumatic stress, and for the most part, people use that interchangeably with vicarious trauma. But I do know that there are some folks who think of secondary traumatic stress in a more specific way, where exposure to trauma or vicarious trauma reactivates or triggers someone's personal history of trauma. So it's a secondary response in that way. Regardless, though, I think it's important for us to recognize that built into the very nature of our job, there are risks for us. And when we work with people who are struggling, we're going to be affected because we're human beings working with human beings. And their trauma becomes our trauma exposure. So backing up, I do want to say that vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue are not the same, but they share a lot of space. You can't see, but I'm making like a little Venn diagram motion with my hands. I think a lot of compassion fatigue, I think it's sort of a more broad experience whereas vicarious trauma is a more specific type of work-related response. So for that reason, a good amount of our material today is going to refer to vicarious trauma because the same tools that we would use to assess and process and manage vicarious trauma will also be effective when we're addressing compassion fatigue as well. So as I mentioned, stress is often thought of as a negative thing, but it's actually a little bit more complex than that. So positive life events like moving or getting married or starting a new job can be stressful as well. And this graphic shows how stress can affect our performance. So when we experience no stress at all, in the green zone here, we feel relaxed and laid back, which feels great, but doesn't really engage us. In the yellow zone, we see the optimum amount of stress, which is just enough stress that we're energized and able to focus on a task. I know that sometimes instead of referring to myself as a procrastinator, I used to call myself a pressure worker because I needed just like a little bit of stress in order to get things going, and that would really help me focus. But as our stress increases, our performance tends to suffer. So we see that in the orange zone, and exhaustion starts to set in. And when we face even more stress, we start to feel anxiety and panic and anger, and our performance level starts to get to its lowest. So then why is some stress actually helpful for us, and other stress leads us to feel overwhelmed? Well, there's the duration of stress. How long does it go on? For example, if you have an audit coming up next month, there might be some added stress, but it's relatively short-lived. For most people, there's some degree of work-related stress, like this sense that the work is never done and there's always more to come. And this element of stress is certainly not unique to those of us in the human service field, but what our line of work does really layer in here is that sense that there are systems in place that will continue to make our jobs harder and more stressful. And until those things change, our stress will continue to be in place. The degree of uncertainty is very predictive of how impactful stress will be. So I would say that this and importance are two areas where our work is really quite different from other professions. There are people who have a lot more predictability about their jobs than we generally do. We don't usually know what we're going to walk into at work most of the time. I can tell you that in all the years I've been working, what's on my Outlook calendar as far as what my day and work week is going to look like almost never actually lines up to what my day ends up being, or my week. Like maybe for like a day or a few hours those line up, but to have a whole week where things kind of go as planned and I can anticipate what's coming even if I don't like it, that's just not part of the reality of my work life. Things come up, and that's the nature of human services, and it adds to our stress. So I will say that I think one way that we do have control over how much work-related stress we experience is by thinking about where we experience uncertainty at work and how we respond to that. So there are some people who aren't really that stressed out by uncertainty. I know when I was an outreach worker, I had a coworker who really enjoyed the uncertainty of his job. He was someone who felt really like bored and stifled by having a strict schedule, and he definitely did not keep an Outlook calendar. And I think it's safe to say that he was actually really drawn to outreach because of how much uncertainty there was in the job. So for him, that was a really good match. But I've also worked with people, I'm thinking of one worker in particular, who really liked knowing what to expect and felt very overwhelmed and thrown off when things didn't go as planned. but he also had a job that was never going to be very predictable. So I think it's worth asking ourselves, how do my career choices match up with my responses to uncertainty? I think that another element of uncertainty in our work that is really dramatically different from other professions is this sense of uncertainty about the basic safety of others. So there are people who can go through their entire professional life without ever really worrying, is someone who I know through work, are they going to be alive tomorrow? I know when I worked in substance use treatment on the west side of Chicago, when we were heading into a holiday weekend, I almost always would worry about, like, how many people are going to overdose this weekend. When it's really hot out, or in Chicago when it gets really cold, we worry about whether the folks we work with have a safe place to be that shelters them from the elements. And so that's really stressful for us, especially when we think about the duration of that, right? That can be ongoing. And I think that speaks to this last element, which is importance. So for many of us, our work is really important to us. We bring passion and a sense of purpose and very often motivation from our own personal lives to our work. And when we're doing the work well and when we're doing it right, the people that we serve and the things that happen in their lives become really important to us, and they have an impact on us. We also work in human services, so whether your role is in direct service or at an administrative level, the impact of our work is measured in how human lives are affected, and how well we do our job can impact things like funding, housing, policies, resources that are made available to people or not. And so our work has a really significant level of importance. We'll talk a little bit more later on about how the current pandemic affects our relationship to work, but I do want to note here that these elements of stress are very much at play right now. The duration of this crisis is exhausting. It's already been going on for 5 months, and it seems like it's unlikely to end anytime soon. There are so many unknowns about this crisis, and its impact is very profound. So our current situation is a perfect storm for increased stress, and I think people are very much experiencing that. So looking at these elements of stress kind of helps us understand why that may be. I also want to speak to the effects of cumulative stress. So I think sometimes we think it's the traumatic events or critical incidents that have the biggest impact on us, but cumulative stress has the potential to be really damaging as well. And this is really kind of speaking to the duration that we were just talking about on the last slide. The chronic nature of some of these seemingly small, low-intensity stressors can gradually pile up. So here, we want to make sure that we're addressing the little things rather than ignoring them or brushing them under the rug, because we want to keep the small things small, because if we don't deal with them, then that's when they become big. So here I want to walk through the different stages of burnout. Like I mentioned earlier, burnout is something that by definition happens over time, so we see a progression with it. Burnout starts with exhaustion, which, like we said, is unfortunately quite common in many, many workplaces. I think guilt and shame, we get here quickly in our field because the stakes are high, and that puts a pressure on us to be at our best at work, right? I have friends who can show up to work on a few hours of sleep or be really distracted or kind of checked out and just go through the motions of their day and perform their job reasonably well. And most of us don't really have jobs like that. our jobs require that we be pretty present and bring most of our capacity with us on a daily basis. And so when we aren't able to be our best selves at work every single day, which is an impossible standard to maintain because we're human beings, we feel some kind of guilt and shame about it because it's high stakes work. So the next stage is this cynicism and callousness. And this is where we begin to see some of that compassion fatigue and disillusionment, where we lose that sense of purpose and meaning that often brought us to the work. And sometimes we see this with people who've worked in the field for a really long time. But I also know in my experience, I've also seen this a lot with folks who are just a year or two into their career, where like the sheen of the job has started to wear off. And there's a realization that this kind of work is really more of a marathon rather than a sprint, and they haven't like quite figured out their pacing yet. So this is where I hear things from staff like, I think I just need to care less. Or we see folks who are no longer very sensitive to their clients' experiences or their coworkers' experiences and feel pretty hopeless and helpless to do anything about it. And then the last stage of burnout is crisis. And this is where we see people have pretty serious problems in terms of their health or their relationships or functioning. And I will say it's really hard for us to recognize or really even honor the effects of burnout until they reach this crisis stage. So it's important for us to think about, how can I notice or intervene much sooner, and to be able to ask, like, how does work or my relationship to work, how does that affect how I take care of my health or show up in my relationships, or just how I manage to function and get things done. So I know I had several years where I worked a few different jobs that were incredibly stressful and very demanding. And I ended up in the ER 3 times within like 11 months for just like weird, mysterious health issues that would present as a crisis. And honestly, it still didn't even come together for me of like, wow, I think I'm not really managing work very well, and that work is starting to interfere with my health and functioning. I was kind of like, oh, like it's not that big of a deal. I'll just bring my laptop and I can work while I wait in the ER. I'm just going to be sitting there for hours. It's great. I can get so much done. So we don't want to get to that point. And we'll talk more about how we can detect these things and address them much sooner. So in thinking about vicarious trauma, it's the emotional residue. And I really like that word. It does feel like a residue. It's something that sticks to us and kind of coats us. But it's the residue that we experience because of our exposure to people's trauma stories and the ways that we witness people's responses, their pain and fear and terror, as well as their dissociation and their shutdown. And it's really the impact of our exposure to people's traumatic disclosures. It's different from burnout because it can occur at any moment. But the more burned out I am, the lower my capacity will be and the more vulnerable I'll be to vicarious trauma, and vice versa. The more vicarious trauma I've experienced, the more susceptible I'll be to experiencing burnout. So the two of these are different but very closely linked. So throughout our time today, you'll see me referencing, and you'll see the little links on the slides, but there's a vicarious trauma toolkit, and it's in the references and resources, but it's a really helpful model and has just a ton of really great resources in it, so I would definitely recommend taking a look through it. But they provide this model and of work-related trauma exposure, And this is a really nice overview, and this is actually kind of our roadmap for the rest of our time here this morning. So we'll talk about the change in worldview that comes from exposure to work-related trauma. And then we'll look at the spectrum of responses, beginning with identifying symptoms of vicarious trauma, and we'll wrap up by discussing the positive end of the spectrum, where we experience vicarious resilience. So when we are exposed to trauma at work, I think sometimes we assume that our status as helpers grants us immunity from the suffering that we witness, and we're wrong. If we're going to work with people who've experienced trauma, we have to acknowledge that our work affects us. So this change in worldview is described as the transformation or change in a helper's inner experience as a result of responsibility for and empathic engagement with traumatized clients. All of us carry what I often refer to as an invisible knapsack of trauma disclosures, just the things that we can't ever unsee or unhear or unknow. And I know for me, it's really changed the way that I see the world to know that there are people walking around who have enacted and inflicted, as well as survived, all of the different traumatic events that I've become aware of in my career. And this change in worldview is usually the result of like a cumulative exposure to traumatic stimuli. So in the book, Trauma Stewardship, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes, but one of the things she describes in the early chapters is being at like a beautiful vista at the top of the mountain, and she's looking out and everyone around her is seeing this beautiful scenery and being, positively affected by it. And because of the way her work has affected her, she's looking out at the top of this mountain and wondering, I wonder how many people have died by suicide here. So the work affects the way that we see things. We can be looking at the same thing, but see it very differently. And I think that's a really powerful thing to acknowledge, that it's inevitable that we're going to be affected by this work, and that part of that effect is that it's going to change how we see the world. I know that none of us came to this work thinking that it would be easy, which it's not, but it can be daunting to realize the weight of what we've taken on. I think it can also be really helpful to be mindful and conscious of it, and to realize that it also has the power to change us in really positive ways, and that's usually what drew us in to begin with.
Susie?
Yes.
Hi, we had a question. If you could just name that book again, what it was called.
Yeah, it's called Trauma Stewardship. And so actually this reference on this slide, Vandernoot, Lipsky, and Burke, those are the authors of Trauma Stewardship. So I will say about the book, I would really recommend it if you haven't read it before. I think it's a pretty landmark book in terms of how to manage the effects of work, because it speaks to people's experiences in a very real and realistic way, and it has some really nice concrete strategies for managing trauma exposure. So she says, evaluating our response to trauma exposure is critical because how we are impacted by our work in the present directly affects our work in the future. So part of our responsibility is to evaluate our response. So we'll look at some of the different things that we want to be on the lookout for. The DSM gives us a set of criteria or different symptoms that we can look for that would indicate that someone's continuing to be affected by a traumatic event. What is interesting to note, and I want to make sure to point out, is that repeated exposure to traumatic material, including as a part of your job, is actually included in the DSM's definition of trauma. So some of us may experience PTSD, but even if we don't meet the full criteria, I think it's still helpful to look at the DSM criteria to identify some different ways that we might be impacted by the traumatic disclosures that are a part of our job. So the DSM criteria for PTSD includes 4 clusters of symptoms. The first is re-experiencing. This might be things like thinking about work when we don't want to be thinking about it, or having images pop into our minds, or having dreams about work or stress dreams, which I have definitely experienced. The next symptom cluster is avoidance. So I might try not to think about work or how it's affected me, and I might try to really avoid my own emotional response to work. Sometimes this avoidance is intentional, but a lot of the time it's also unconscious. We also see avoidance show up in terms of attendance. When people start to call in sick or show up late to work, sometimes that's a manifestation of avoidance. I got to the point with one job where like several times a week, I had to pull over on my way to work because I just felt such intense dread about going. And I would just have to like sit in my car, and it wasn't that long of a commute, but I'd have to just like sit in my car and convince myself to continue on my way to work. We also see avoidance come up in the form of like not wanting to talk to our supervisor or coworker about tough cases, or noticing that like we might be relieved when certain people no-show for their appointments. When the work is really having a strong impact on us, we can actually get to the point of dissociation or depersonalization. I've had periods of time where when I get home from work, like all I can do is just sit and stare at a blank wall for like 30 minutes because I was just so drained that I needed to just like not be present with anything at all for a while before I could sort of like be present again. The next symptom cluster is negative changes in the way I think and feel about myself and others. And I remember really noticing this change when I first started to work with a lot of trauma survivors. I kind of started to wonder, like, is the world just a totally unsafe place? Because I knew so many people who had just been so horrifically injured. Sometimes we can feel depressed and then withdraw or isolate from friends or family. Or I might even feel like this work has somehow changed me, which we talked about that it will, but to the point where I'm now just different from other people and they don't understand me and I don't understand them anymore. We can also feel sometimes some of the thought changes we can experience of feeling like this work is sort of meaningless and pointless, and people are just going to continue to traumatize and hurt other people, so what's the point? And this is kind of some of that like disillusionment that we were talking about earlier in terms of burnout, where we lose touch with our sense of purpose and meaning that brought us to the work. And then the last symptom cluster is what we call change in arousal and reactivity. And this usually refers to physiological changes. So we can have difficulty eating or sleeping. We might have a lot of difficulty concentrating, to where it takes a lot longer to do like our progress notes or other paperwork than it normally does. We might feel wound up and on edge all the time and really have a hard time being able to turn off, which often then brings on some of those re-experiencing symptoms. So things like thinking about work all night when we're at home. And I want to say that most of us have probably experienced some of these symptoms at different times, and it doesn't mean that we all have PTSD. It means that we have a very normal response to traumatic exposure. So it becomes PTSD when we meet a certain number of these criteria all at the same time, and when that persists for more than a month and starts to interfere with our functioning. So this trauma exposure response wheel comes from Trauma Stewardship, the book I was referencing. And I want to talk through this in some more detail because in the book she does a really excellent job of exploring that intersection of where our personal self and our work self meet and interact with each other. So as we talk through this, I'm going to ask you to really think about for yourself, where can you locate some of these things within you and your work self? And what do you sound like, or what sorts of things do you say? Or what kind of behaviors come up for you when you experience some of these different effects of the work? And then I would add to that, how have some of your responses changed since the start of the pandemic, and what's most prominent for you right now? So starting at the top with feeling helplessness and hopelessness, we all hold like different perceptions that contribute to these feelings, especially during traumatic circumstances. When people hold themselves personally responsible for situations that really no one could reasonably be expected to master, they feel more helpless and hopeless. When people have the perception that a traumatic event is going to be long-lived and there's really no possibility of relief, that also amplifies these feelings. And then when people also feel like they're likely to repeat their current struggles in another setting, so kind of this idea that like it doesn't matter if I address this here, I'm just going to do the same thing again somewhere else, that also increases that sense of helplessness and hopelessness. In terms of the idea that we can never do enough, I really like how she points out in the book that sometimes this taps into our sense that we're never going to be enough. And for people who come to this work and feel like a personal calling or a sense that I have to heal the world or heal myself through healing others, or feel this sense of obligation, it's really important to question, how can I create some boundaries with work, and how do I continue to work in a field where the work is never going to be done, but still be able to feel like I am enough, even if I can't do enough, because it's this combination of I can't ever be enough and I can't ever do enough that really tears people apart. Hypervigilance, we know that it's a trauma response, and the way it shows up for us sometimes is being really hyper-focused on work and having a hard time being present for anything else. Hypervigilance, I think, also shows up in our work pacing. So I know I've been guilty at times where I work in a frantic manner and I have kind of a frenetic energy about the way I go through my day, even when there's not a crisis, or I just feel like I have to make the most of every minute and be on at all times. And sometimes that's a function of my trauma exposure, and then sometimes it becomes something that I kind of take on and start to embody as part of my work identity. Diminished creativity. I think we all start to fall into patterns and become less flexible about how we work, and then we end up getting frustrated with the people we serve and the people we work with, that the same thing we've been doing isn't working anymore. And that's because people change and we need to be creative and flexible and adapt our responses. And when we're not able to be creative in that way, it shows up in our work, which speaks to the inability to embrace complexity, where we start to demonstrate this black and white thinking at work. This one, I think, shows up a lot within team or organizational dynamics. So there's almost always a tension between administrators and people who make policies and direct service providers and the people who are on the ground doing the direct work. And that tension is almost always present in an organization. And as someone who's been in both roles and sometimes been in both roles at the same time, I understand that it's complex. And when I'm in a good place, I'm able to understand and acknowledge that everyone is just doing their job, even if those jobs sometimes feel like they're in opposition to one another, they also rely on each other at the same time. And when people become really entrenched within their trauma exposure response, we see the loss of that complexity in favor of more black and white, either or kind of thinking. And then this shows up in terms of like gossip or negativity or just workplace tension that then contributes to and really exacerbates a lot of these other factors. Minimizing, I think, shows up very often in trivializing situations that aren't the most dire in both our personal and professional realms. And we start to kind of minimize our own response, as well as things that we might normally be able to hold space for and acknowledge the subjective impacts of events. Physical ailments, I spoke to some of the ways that that's manifested for me in the past, but also thinking about how our personal lives intersect with our professional lives. I think when we start to feel like we have no choice about the work that we do, and when we feel like we have to be in this martyred helper's role, we feel obligated to show up at work. And when we feel obligated, we feel tired. And sometimes then we start to take on a persona of chronic exhaustion and fatigue. This inability to listen or deliberate avoidance, I think sometimes shows up when, like I mentioned, we can be a little bit relieved when people no-show for appointments, or when we start to avoid social contact and feel like it's just going to be tiring and take up too much energy, and we stop participating in our typical social activities. Dissociative moments. This is a natural and protective response to trauma exposure. I should mention, as is everything on this wheel, but it becomes problematic for us when we become stoic about it and pretend it isn't happening and just push through it. Or on the flip side, I've worked with people who almost like champion their dissociation as like a badge of pride and talk about how often they dissociate at work. And those are things for us to really notice and tend to, rather than try to bulldoze or trivialize. This sense of persecution shows up for us when we begin to feel martyred and are just looking for proof that we're being exploited in one way or another, whether it's by the people we serve, our organization, or folks in our personal lives. Guilt really pulls us out of the present moment and makes it hard for us to enjoy the things that can be real resources for us. I know people who've gone on vacation and feel the whole time like, I feel so bad that I'm here in this beautiful place and enjoying myself and connecting with my loved ones when there are people who don't have a roof over their head. And that makes it really hard for us to receive the protective benefit of the things that can really help buffer against traumatic exposures. Fear comes in the form of fearing potential victimization and fearing that something that might happen to us that we've known about happening to others. I think this also shows up for us, though, in terms of being afraid of having the intense feelings and not wanting to feel the things that we feel. There's a little bit of avoidance at play here, too. But if we think about how we know that someone has managed their trauma, it's that they can feel what they feel and they can know what they know. And for us, it becomes really scary sometimes to feel the reality of our response to traumatic exposure. Anger and cynicism. Most of us are not very skilled in managing or even recognizing our own anger. And our discomfort with our own anger then becomes a barrier to working with clients around their anger. And in the book, she offers a very bold exercise of asking a loved one to tell you about your own anger. What does it look like and sound like when I'm angry? How do you recognize when I'm angry? How does it come out, and how does that affect you, and how does that affect us? And I think for a lot of us, that would be really uncomfortable and challenging to truly listen and stay connected to that feedback. But if we can do that, it would be an incredibly powerful tool in learning about and taking steps toward managing our anger in some new ways. The inability to empathize and numbing comes up when we are feeling just so saturated and full that we really can't absorb anything else. So I think a lot of people numb with substances, with Netflix, with mindlessly scrolling or posting on social media. I think one way to think about the numbing is, how willing and able are we to sit with ourselves and be present with our experiences and how we're affected. And, sometimes another way that we numb is by staying busy all the time and kind of living in a frenzy where we start to take on that identity of being busy. And so almost if we're saying, I'm going to make it so that I'm too busy to feel any part of me or any part of you. Addictions, I mentioned substance use, but we also want to consider other behaviors like sex, video games, gambling, use of social media, things that we often use to help us turn off. But like with the numbing or the inability to empathize, we also want to think about the temptation to stay wired or on at all times. And one of the things she points out in the book that I really appreciate is this idea of an addiction to work and falling into patterns of overworking where we choose to work more and more and attend to our personal lives less and less. Grandiosity. This is an extension of the idea that our work becomes so intertwined with our identity that there's this belief, very often unconscious, that if the work I do is very important, then so am I. And so for some folks, I think work then begins to feed some part of them that needs to be fed and then holds an inflated importance. With grandiosity, I also see this in terms of trusting our coworkers or even the people we serve to do the very important work that we are doing and not falling into that trap of thinking only I can do this. I'm thinking of a counselor who I supervised who had a very difficult caseload and worked with some folks who had experienced a great amount of trauma, and she worked very closely and very well with them. But she refused to take time off, and she would tell me, if I'm not here, they're not going to be okay. And she kind of lost track of the idea that this person has survived for a great amount of time, and they have a lot of resources and resiliency within them. And we have a team of counselors who are also able to support this person. And it'll be okay if you take some time for yourself. So I guess before we move on, I do want to say that the point here isn't to say that these things are good or bad. All trauma responses are adaptive in some settings in some ways, right? Because we wouldn't do these things if they weren't necessary to help us. So more so, we just want to be able to notice and recognize that these are ways that trauma impacts us. And we want to start to take note of how and when does this show up for me, and how and when does it get in the way or become problematic. Because this isn't a black and white, always good, always bad kind of thing. It's a lot more nuanced and complex than that. So we want to be able to recognize that when I do dissociate, that's an indication of a trauma response and I'm being affected by my work. And maybe I need to dissociate a little bit to get through the rest of my day, because I don't have the option to just cancel the rest of my sessions and go home and cuddle with my pet and then connect with a trusted friend, right? I have to do what I have to do because I have a job and I have to hold myself together and get through the day. But we also want to be able to notice, wow, I dissociated a lot of the day today and I really wasn't present. And that means something's coming up for me, and I should at least notice and think about that, and think about what might be a helpful response to tend to the part of myself that wasn't able to be present. So I know that we're coming up on our halfway time. I want to get through a couple more slides and then we'll go ahead and take our break. We've been talking about different ways that we as individuals are affected by work, but we also know that organizations are more than just the sum of their parts. Certainly an organization is affected by what's happening with its staff members, but the organization itself also affects what's happening with its individual workers. There's an interactional relationship there. So when organizations are experiencing compassion fatigue, we see it come through with high levels of absenteeism or tardiness, a lot of changes and lack of stability within coworker relationships, where we may see more staff conflict and friction. We can see organizational compassion fatigue manifest in terms of staff who frequently challenge the policies and procedures that are in place, or staff can even become aggressive, often more so verbally. There are times when staff really struggle with completing their tasks or keeping their deadlines, and there can be a real rigidity where people are very reluctant to change, even if they're unhappy with the status quo. And that's where we get to the place of having an unhappy workforce who don't trust that things will get better down the road. So even when someone comes in and has great self-care systems in place and has put a lot of professional and personal work into developing healthy relationship to work and has robust tools for managing compassion fatigue, we can see where it's going to be really hard for that person to thrive or even maintain their morale if they're working at an organization whose culture is characterized by compassion fatigue. So I want to take a minute and ask you all to think about your own signs of trauma exposure. There's the frog is on here because there's this saying that if you put a frog into boiling water, it'll jump out, but a frog sitting in water that slowly turns to a boil will burn. And we know that the person or organization that is affected by compassion fatigue is usually the last one to recognize it. We need to tune ourselves to pay attention. So if you go ahead and put into the chat things that you feel comfortable sharing about what kinds of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, or self-talk or changes in relationships show up that indicate that you are having some type of response to work. I'm glad I'm not the only one who knows that frog analogy. Not wanting to go to work, absolutely. Kind of staying to yourself, avoiding tasks, lack of sleep, more sleep, a lot of isolation. I see that shoulders tensing up, kind of we start to hold ourselves with our shoulders up all the time, feeling like what I do doesn't matter. You all have an excellent sense of how you are affected. I think what's helpful to consider here is also what are you least likely to notice and what might other people observe. Distancing, feeling like you need to get away. Absolutely. Hating when the phone rings, especially when it rings at like 4:55. Yeah, facial expressions, I like that one. So thank you all for sharing this. I think it's helpful for us to see not just that other ways that people are affected, but to notice I'm not the only one who feels this way sometimes, and it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me as a worker. It means that there's something happening in my relationship to work, and that's something that I may want to try and address. And yes, Cassandra, you're entering responses perfectly. So before we take a break, I want to talk quickly about ongoing assessments. So there's two formal instruments that I really like and recommend using with your organization. So the first is the professional quality of life scale. And this is 30 self-report items that ask about how often someone's had both positive and negative experiences at work in the last 30 days. And this is things like, I find it difficult to separate my personal life from my life as a helper. Because of my helping, I have felt on edge about various things, or I'm proud of what I can do to help. I think this can be a really nice tool to use for yourself to sort of take your own temperature and check in, but it's also a really nice supervisory tool as a way to touch base with your staff and make sure you have a clear sense of how they're doing with work, both in terms of what's going well and where might this person be struggling a little bit. The Vicarious Trauma Toolkit that I mentioned earlier offers this Vicarious Trauma Organizational Readiness Guide, and this assesses how the organization as a whole is doing in terms of managing vicarious trauma. And the toolkit has really detailed plans that outline not only how to use this assessment, but also what to do afterward in order to shore up any areas that might need some additional attention. So it asks about these 5 different areas that we'll explore later, but these are just 2 tools that I wanted to be able to share with you all. So with that, let's go ahead and, Karina, if there are any questions that come in, I can answer those now, and then we can take our quick break.
I know we've had a lot of people asking about the slides. They will be available on our website within 30 days, and also the recording of the webinar. I'm also making a list of the resources that I'll have available for you to view at the end of the presentation. You can use your phone to take a picture of the slide with the resources.
Thank you.
I don't see any, I think you're doing a good job with answering them as they come in.
Okay, great. Well then, why don't we go ahead and take our break?
Okay, so if everybody can be back at about 11:17, we're taking a 5-minute break. Thank you. Susie?
Yes. Yes.
Is that resource change in worldview? Is that a book or a PDF? What is it?
Let me look real quick. I believe it's from a book.
I'm having a hard time finding that one.
Yeah. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. It's from the book, or it's from a training curriculum. So it's, here, I'll send you the.
Yeah, if you can send it through, I'll copy it and paste that too for everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Did that work?
Yes, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone back. And Susie, if you're ready to get started, we'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Okay. So, everything that we have discussed so far is a part of our job. Um, and like I said, we know that even under ideal circumstances, we have difficult jobs. We provide care to people who are engaged in a nonlinear process of making change and significant changes to their lives as they pursue recovery. We're regularly exposed to traumatic disclosures. We hear stories of relapse and death, and we come to care about people. And part of our job very often includes bearing witness to their pain. But on top of that, we cope with things like staff turnover and low resources. We work with people who have low resources. We advocate for change and systemic oppression. We have to deal with billing and insurance and paperwork that often feels redundant. And so it's a high stress, high stakes profession that's not very predictable. And compassion fatigue is a very common experience within the field. And of course, there are significant rewards to the work, which is what draws us in and keeps us here. And I want to say I noticed during the break that Hannah mentioned in one of the comments that she doesn't like the idea that that this work means signing up for a negative change in worldview, which it doesn't. It means that we're just signing up for a change in worldview, and it can be a really positive one, which we'll talk about later. But even during the best of times, none of us have an easy job, and we also know that these are not the best of times right now. So right now, we have all heard this phrase increasingly that we're living in unprecedented times, and it is really so true. None of us, regardless of our age or how long we've been working in the field, have ever seen anything like this before. There's widespread illness and death, and we hear about it on a very regular basis, depending how often you tune into the news. And I know for a lot of folks, it's this really difficult balance of wanting to stay informed but not getting overly saturated with the news. We know that there are so many people who are impacted by unemployment and financial instability and all of the ripple effects that come with that. People's mental health is definitely being challenged, especially I think as we are realizing how long we're likely to be living with this new normal. We are very isolated from our social support in ways that we really haven't experienced before. And there's a level of anxiety or fear for a lot of folks and just completing everyday tasks like going to the grocery store or to the doctor. And for a lot of people in our field, we experience what's referred to as a conflict of consciousness, where we feel really torn about maintaining the safety of ourselves and our loved ones at home, and our dedication to the people we serve, especially when we work with a vulnerable population whose risks are especially high right now. And in talking with folks, I hear a lot of this right now, just a great deal of fear and anger and anxiety and pain about this perception that we have to either take care of ourselves and our families or take care of the people that we serve, and that no matter what we choose, we're going to be increasing the risk for someone. Because we're in uncharted territory here, in a lot of ways, we're paving the road as we walk it. Our workplaces were probably not set up for this. So as a result, a lot of changes happen very quickly, and necessary, but because these changes were so urgent and time sensitive, in many places, the changes were done in a much more like top-down manner than might usually happen. There wasn't time to collect input and collaboratively come up with solutions. Leadership may be much more directive than they usually are. So it's not just the changes themselves, but also the process and rate of change that is so different for us. Karina, I think we might be hearing some of your typing if you're not on mute. But because of these changes, what used to be second nature about work is now new and unknown, and there's mental strain involved with that. It's almost like starting a new job where we have to learn all of these new ways of doing things. With the move to telemedicine, we have to learn new technology in the midst of trying to maintain connection with people in our programs who may themselves be at increased risk and have increased needs, and we feel that sense of guilt or pressure to meet their needs, but it's harder for us to do that right now. So we're also facilitating this transition to teletherapy for people that we serve, and some folks may not have access to technology or know how to use it. But it's not just the technology and logistics. I think it's also the clinical pieces. It's just different to do sessions, and I don't have to tell you this, it's just different to do sessions over the phone or on video rather than in person. On the phone, we lose those visual cues, and while it's helpful to be face-to-face with someone through video, we also just have to recognize that it's not the same as being in person. It changes some of the dynamics, and it can be very tiring for us to be on video all the time. Times of crisis are also when we normally want closer connection and to make use of as many resources as are available. So it's really hard for us to assess the safety and well-being of the people we serve with these new barriers in place. How do we stay connected to our folks, especially those who are at heightened risk for COVID, while also keeping them as safe and as healthy as possible? And then when we work with vulnerable populations who are now even more vulnerable, people who are low income, people experiencing homelessness, older adults, people living in a nursing home, folks with pre-existing health or mental health conditions, folks who live alone, people living in homes where there's violence, people with mobility issues. What kind of creative strategies and solutions can we implement? What kind of recovery resources are available to people, because we understand that the risk for relapse or increased use is very high right now. So we're having to grapple with these questions on the fly, and we're just in uncharted territory. Meanwhile, there's no more separation between work and home. They're just the same place right now, which brings its own set of complications. So for folks who have children or older adults living in the home, they're challenged with even more multitasking than before and trying to provide care to their loved ones while also trying to maintain their job and their job performance. And we know that childcare and elder care options are very limited and complicated right now. Some folks are, as a result, needing some more time to complete their work because of all of these contextual factors, and that makes it even harder for people to maintain a healthy balance between work and their personal lives. And I know in talking to people, in a lot of instances, folks are actually working longer hours now that they're at home. And I think this is partly because we've lost that physical boundary between work and home, which makes it easier to blur our other boundaries regarding work. One of the other things I hear from a lot of people is that their homes aren't really set up for working remotely. So people who live with roommates, whose roommates are also now working from home, or like folks who live in a studio apartment. So one of my colleagues has a roommate, and she was telling me, I wake up in my bedroom, I do all my sessions in my bedroom, I write progress notes in my bedroom, I participate in meetings in my bedroom. And then after work, if I want privacy to connect with my friends or family, I do that from my bedroom, and then I go to sleep in my bedroom, and I repeat it all the next day. And it's really hard to turn off and create separation from work when we don't have any kind of physical separation. And then there's all the very many unknowns to grapple with. How long will we be doing this? That's one of the many big questions right now. I know in terms of work, some workplaces have already said we're going to be remote through the end of the year. Others have not. How much notice will I have when things change? What will I do about child or elder care when that happens? And then in terms of life, there's so many questions, like when is it safe to see my friends and family? Is everyone okay? How are my loved ones doing physically, mentally, financially? How do I balance my own physical health and my mental health? Have I been exposed? Can I loosen up my restrictions? And then, like I said, just how long will this go on and what will life be like after this? And that's where this pandemic is really the perfect storm to create very high levels of stress. And if we think back to that earlier slide about what makes stress more impactful, duration, uncertainty, and importance, we see all of those coming together here. Yes, it's like Groundhog Day. Thank you, Karen. So, very understandably, people are exhausted. As humans, we take comfort in familiarity and routine, and right now, we have very little sense of predictability and stability. So it takes a lot more energy for all of us to do the same things that we've always done in these new ways and within this new context. And we're seeing that not just at work, but at home and really at every level of our society. Just everything requires more effort, more thoughts, more emotion, just more energy. And we're hearing more about this idea of caution fatigue as well, that it's tiring for us to maintain this level of vigilance, which takes a toll and either leads to people changing their behavior and doing things that aren't necessarily advised, or feeling worn down from being so cautious all the time, or both. So we're exhausted. And being so exhausted puts us at increased risk to experience more compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. And then layer on top of that the fact that we don't have access to a lot of our usual supports, both at work and in our personal lives. So, like logistically speaking, most of us don't have a well-functioning and complete home office. With like printers and scanners and fax machines and a computer with a big screen. So there's a lot more time and energy spent in just some of the like administrative day-to-day components. But we also don't have access to some of the emotional and social supports that work offers. So when you have a tough session or a confusing interaction with another staff member, there's no one there to bear witness to your experience and to check in with you and ask, hey, are you okay? And we miss those small social interactions that happen in our workplaces that are very hard, if not impossible, to recreate virtually. So things like the 5-minute conversation you have with a colleague from a different department who you don't really know all that well, but you chat for a couple minutes while you heat up your lunch, or the person who is, you know, loosely a work friend who you probably wouldn't really ever contact outside of work, and you might not even have their phone number or like know their last name, but when you run into each other, you stop and chat for a few minutes. Or just like that morning conversation with your office mates, or the person who asks for your recipe when you're eating lunch. So we're missing all of these interactions, which are small ways that recharge and refill our cup. And they serve as pretty neutral social outlets that don't demand very much of us. And at face value, they don't really offer that much in return. But when we consider the absence of those interactions, we see that they're actually really important, and their content might not be particularly meaningful, but the process is. Because we perform jobs that require so much emotional labor, it feels really good for us to have these small, easy interactions alongside other people in ways that don't feel like they require any work, and they're not monitored or evaluated or structured in any kind of way. And they're not things that we build time into our schedule for or make a conscious effort to make them happen, which is part of the beauty of it, right? It gives us little bits of social contact without any sense of obligation or responsibility. And in our personal lives, we also experience more isolation as well as reduced access to a lot of the activities that help us take care of ourselves. So think like, even if they're open, a lot of people are reluctant to go to the gym or go to restaurants or out with friends or get on a plane and travel somewhere to visit friends or family. So for very good reasons, our workplaces and our personal lives to a significant degree are now organized around safety rather than our values. And of course, that makes sense. It's important that we take measures to keep people as safe and as healthy as possible, but that has really significant implications for how we're doing in terms of managing compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. We want to be in connection with other people around trauma. It's what draws so many of us to the field. And, we're either working through our own trauma and seeking connection, or we want to help others addressing their trauma. And regardless where it stems from, we really want and need to be in connection when it comes to trauma. We know that what is unbearable in isolation becomes more tolerable when it's held in connection. And right now, it's much harder for us to access and maintain our connection to others. So how do we manage all of this? First, I think we pause, take a breath, and just acknowledge that this is a lot. We are holding and managing a lot. And many of us probably have been for a while, well before this crisis started. And now we have even more on our plate. So we give ourselves permission to feel the effects of that. And then we start thinking about strategies we can implement in a few different areas that will help hold us. So looking at this list, I think it can be helpful to identify where things are going well for you personally and in your organization. And then to think about where are one or two areas that you want to focus your attention on. So on a personal level, we need to practice self-care, which we'll talk about some more in a few minutes. But we also really need to build and spend time in our identity outside of work, which can be really hard, particularly in this field, because our work feels so personal and it can become a part of our identity. But we also need to have a sense of who we are when we're not at work. A few years ago, I found myself talking to an acquaintance at a party who asked me, "What do you do for fun?" And I at least had the foresight not to say it out loud, but the first thought that popped into my head was, I work a lot. So that's not good. At the professional level, I think being able to access peer support is so important because it's really vulnerable to say, I'm struggling with this. And ideally, we can talk to our supervisors about that as well, but there's a power differential at play there. And so we want to have that peer support. For several years, I participated in a trauma consultation group outside of my work that really focused on processing vicarious trauma, and it was such an important resource for my professional self-care. And a big part of it was that no one from my workplace was a part of the group, which just made it feel a lot safer to talk freely about what was happening for me. At the organizational level, we need quality, trauma-informed support from our supervisors. So I'm actually doing a webinar, I think it's just been moved to early January about supervision, so quick plug if you want to tune in. But our organizations should support professional development and have policies and procedures that acknowledge the impact of vicarious trauma and then appropriately support and resource staff in managing it. And I think that speaks to the need for community level support as well. It's really hard to practice trauma-informed care without systemic support. And we want to have systems that are rooted in trauma-informed approaches. And that includes having reliable access to the resources we need to stay healthy and well while we're doing this challenging work. So this also comes from the book Trauma Stewardship, and this is their model for different ways to center yourself with regard to our trauma exposure response. So she talks about these 4 different directions, and to the north is a place of inquiry. So taking time to be thoughtful and observe our present moment, and be able to ask things like, what is our intention? Why am I doing what I'm doing? She asks, is trauma mastery a factor for me? And that refers to the idea that are we trying to gain mastery over our previous personal traumas or situations of helplessness? And like, are we motivated in work by efforts to heal our own wounds? And if that is the case, what else are we doing to tend to those wounds? Because that helps us create less dependence on work. And then being able to check in and assess, is this working for me? To the east, choosing our focus. Where we focus our attention affects our experience. So she offers this exercise of thinking of a challenging work situation and writing down 3 things that make it challenging, and then also writing down 3 things that you appreciate it, and looking at your list, being able to ask, where am I more likely to focus my attention and why? And how does that affect my experience of work? One of the things that trauma does is really invite us to focus on trauma material. So how can we be intentional about choosing where it is that we rest our focus? Plan B reminds us of the fact that we do have freedom and choices. And whether that's Plan B of, what would I do professionally if I wasn't working in this field? Or how can I leave this job and find a new role? But Plan B can also be things like, how can I stay in this role and do it in a way that serves me more effectively? To the south is building compassion and community. So building a microculture of support, folks that both encourage you and hold you accountable. Being able to practice compassion for your colleagues as well as yourself. I think for many of us, self-compassion is sometimes more challenging than offering compassion to others. And being able to ask, is my self-compassion fatigued as well? Large-scale systemic change, when we try and make some changes there, it helps us feel empowered and feel like I don't have to just live with the system as it is forever. And although those changes might not happen overnight, I think very often it's the striving for change that helps transform how we interact with the systems that are in place. To the west is finding balance. So being able to find that ever-elusive work-life balance, and not just in terms of how we spend our time, but also with regard to how we identify our sense of self. Like I said, it's a wonderful thing about our field that we get such pride and sense of identity from our work, but I think it's also a hazard of our field that our identity can get absorbed in our work. So we want to have a clear sense of who my work self is and who my out of work self is. Moving through energy refers to a mindful approach of kind of detoxing and cleansing and letting go of burdens. And this can mean practicing ways of leaving work at work and creating opportunities for building separation. So I've had times where at the end of the day, like I soak up a sponge with water and then wring it out over a plant. And for me, I found that to be meaningful and symbolizing letting go of everything I had absorbed and held on to throughout the day and using that as nourishment for a living thing. And then in terms of gratitude, something I really like to do, especially as a supervisor, is to encourage staff when they have those great days where they're like, yes, this is what I'm here for, to find some way to capture it, whether it's to write themselves an email or for folks that don't like writing so much, to like maybe record a voice memo, but to record in some way their own words and thoughts about what happened today and how it affected me, and being able to hold on to that. So seemingly from the very moment we enter this field, or even before, we hear about the importance of self-care. And I will say, over time, I've come to view self-care as a crucial component of remaining in this profession, rather than something that would just be nice as an add-on. So how do we take care of ourselves in the midst of all these challenges? Self-care takes a lot of different shapes, and I like to distinguish between self-soothing and self-care. So self-soothing activities are things that offer us a distraction or sense of comfort when we're having a hard time. So things like taking a bath, zoning out and watching TV, having a drink, taking time off from work, cuddling up with your pet. This is my dog Buster, by the way. He'd be thrilled to know that he's made it into this PowerPoint. But these are activities that feel good and help refill our cup when our reserves are low, but they don't necessarily help us move forward. Something else I noticed with self-soothing is that something that starts out as soothing, something that helps refill us, like binge watching a new TV show, at some point, it actually starts to drain us again. And instead of feeling like we have more energy as a result of it, we have less, and we're just like stuck on the couch. So it's important that we pay attention to ourselves and check in every now and then to see, am I getting the desired effect? Self-care activities are things that help us increase our capacity and actually grow our cup rather than refill it. But these things don't necessarily feel good all the time. So things like participating in our own therapy or going to bed earlier than we'd like to, practicing meditation, engaging in our own medical care, establishing healthy boundaries. These are things that, while they may take effort and energy, they also offer meaning and support our growth. So self-care isn't everything, and as much as I champion and emphasize the importance of it, I think we don't hear enough about organizational and community care. And I think sometimes self-care gets touted as a way to sort of free us from our obligations to each other. So our organizations play a major role in our well-being and resilience and ability to remain in the work. And part of that is creating organizations and systems that acknowledge the impact of this work and then offer resources, support, and tools for managing it. So the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit extends the idea of trauma-informed care to vicarious trauma-informed care. And they talk about what it means to be vicarious trauma-informed, and they refer to an organization that recognizes the occupational challenges of this field and assumes the responsibility for proactively addressing the impact of vicarious trauma through policies, procedures, practices, and programs. And the toolkit outlines these key aspects of healthy vicarious trauma-informed organizations. I mentioned the VT-org earlier, and one of the things that I like about it is that it helps delineate what's the responsibility of an organization, and what falls beyond their reach into personal self-care or exploration. I know that when I've talked with people in leadership positions, I sometimes hear concerns from them about what will happen if they acknowledge and start to assume some responsibility for taking care of staff. This worry that like the onus will fall entirely on them, or staff will expect to be like coddled or ask for unrealistic things. So I think the VT org is a nice tool for helping both the organization and its members, its staff members, understand how they can work together to promote caring for their workers. So leadership plays a big role in setting the tone and culture and operations of the organization. And vicarious trauma-informed leaders have a clear vision for how to carry out the agency's mission. They model respectful and effective communication, and they really have their finger to the pulse of what's happening within the organization. Leaders need to make information about the organization's strategic plans available to staff. Research actually shows that this lowers workers' levels of vicarious trauma when they have a sense of what is the strategic plan without it becoming their responsibility. We know that managers and supervisors play a big role in their staff's experiences at work. Managers who promote policies and practices that lessen the negative impact of the work and seek out and support their staff following critical incidents are really instrumental in being able to cultivate relationships that have that felt sense of mutual respect and trust. And they tend to have staff members who can overcome high workloads and stay on the job longer. Vicarious trauma-informed organizations promote teamwork and collaboration. There's both formal and informal opportunities for staff to connect with each other. I think a big protective factor against vicarious trauma is just like how enjoyable is it to be at work. I've worked on teams where leadership really struggled to create a positive work environment. In one team I worked in, we had staff retreats that were on site, so we didn't actually retreat to anywhere. And they really felt more like homework than fun. We had like large poster boards that we had to fill out, and we had tasks that we had to complete beforehand. And while I appreciate the intention, the whole thing ended up really falling flat and felt much more like an obligation than anything else. And morale on that team was consistently very low, and the team office was just sort of like quiet and tense and awkward, and there was frequent staff turnover. And work was just not an enjoyable place to be on top of having a very difficult job. And then by contrast, I worked on other teams where we had regularly scheduled retreats that included directors and vice presidents, where we went out to lunch with the rule of no talking about work, no phones, no email. And then like one time, for example, we did an escape room activity. Another time we went to a Cubs game. And yes, we still wrapped up by discussing how could we use what we learned at work, but there was a really strong emphasis on carving out time, including work time, to make sure that we enjoyed each other's company, with the understanding that when staff are struggling, it's important that we've already fostered those strong relationships in order to use each other as a resource. Organizations need to offer training and opportunities for professional development for staff. Really, this begins at the interviewing stage, but certainly during the onboarding process. So what kind of orientation do you offer to new staff, and what kind of ongoing training is available? In terms of health and wellness, what resources does the organization dedicate to promoting staff well-being, and how is staff wellness incorporated into policies and practices? So to best support their staff in managing vicarious trauma, it's important for leadership to be present in a literal way. So during normal times, it's important for leaders to make their rounds in the office, stop by, say hello, check in with folks. I remember I worked at an organization that just absolutely struggled with turnover and low morale. And during a listening session with leadership, someone said to the CEO that it would be nice if they felt more connected to him, that they didn't really feel like they knew him at all or had a sense of what his job entailed, and didn't really feel like he understood their job either. And the CEO's response was, you know, I would absolutely love that. I just don't have time. And invisible leadership just kills staff morale and contributes to that perception that there's a gap between senior leadership and the rest of us. So especially now, it's important for leadership to be present and show face, attend meetings, and schedule times to check in with people, or host a coffee break where you encourage people to just sign into Zoom just to touch base and spend a little time together. Part of vicarious trauma-informed leadership also includes assessing your own level of compassion fatigue. How are you impacted by your work-related stressors and trauma exposure? And what do you do to manage it? And how has that changed over time? I know there are a lot of folks who've moved out of direct service and into more administrative roles, and in part that was to create some distance from exposure to traumatic material because they were experiencing compassion fatigue. So how does that impact their approach as managers and supervisors when their own staff are then impacted? What do you do as a leader to normalize compassion fatigue? It's important for staff to hear senior leadership talking about this and putting it on the table so it doesn't feel like a personal or professional deficiency when people struggle with vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And we can't just check in with people about their struggles. We also have to be able to ask them about times when things are going well and celebrate their success, and help them build rituals and routines for holding on to that part of their work identity as well. Most importantly, leaders need to follow through. So when you ask staff about their experiences of vicarious trauma and offer a space for them to speak openly and honestly about it, and then you do nothing in response, that is a very quick route to losing trust and becoming the target of any kind of perceived problems, whether they fall within your realm or not. So the more transparent leadership can be about what they're doing and when and why, the more relationship capital you build with staff. We know that clients and patients will not stop needing help and support. Disasters will continue to arise. Children will get sick. Trauma will occur. Helping professionals need to continue to explore ways to remain healthy while doing this deeply challenging and rewarding work. So the hope isn't that work isn't just a place where we go to be drained and burned out and where we give, but that it can also be a place that feeds and soothes and provides in return. Which brings us to the idea of vicarious resilience, and that involves the process of learning about overcoming adversity from the trauma survivor and the resulting positive transformation and empowerment through their empathy and interaction. So I can tell you that I have been incredibly fortunate to witness a tremendous amount of resilience in the people I've worked with. Like I mentioned, trauma is what unifies everyone I've served. And while I've been exposed to some really horrific things, I've also been exposed to some truly inspiring and amazing things. And I've been able to see some of the best of humanity. And the hope is that we can find ways for that component of our work to also land and stick with us and become part of our professional identity as well. So how do we do that? The toolkit outlines 5 steps. We've talked a lot about different strategies for increasing our self-awareness and the role that plays in managing our response for work. Maintaining hope, sometimes this requires that we redefine what success looks like and we search for and celebrate small incremental change. Practicing healthy coping. The more proactive and creative and flexible we're able to be in terms of our approach to coping, the better off we'll be. We know that this work is challenging, so we really want to plan for what we can do to cope with these things. Creating strong relationships. We've talked about the protective role of connection in terms of trauma responses. So we want to find the people who can sit in the mud with us when things are hard, but also the folks who will celebrate us and understand that the little moments are actually quite big. Remembering the big picture is staying grounded in what's important and meaningful and really shifting where we rest our attention, because the more we look for and consciously notice resilience and vicarious resilience, the more prominent it becomes. So how does it affect us to have experiences vicarious resilience? I think we kind of all know intuitively or experientially that this is really what draws us to the work, and this is the best of our profession. It helps bring us a greater perspective and appreciation for our own circumstances. It kind of helps reinvigorate us about the work and strengthens and restores our commitment to this profession. The exposure to traumatic material has the power to really positively influence us and not just negatively. So compassion satisfaction refers to the pleasure we derive from work. We experience a sense of pride about the purpose that our work brings and our contributions to the people that we serve, or our programs, or even big picture systemic forces. This helps refill our cup. And vicarious transformation refers to somewhat of a parallel process where we feel a sense of empowerment and hope, increased gratitude, belief in our ability to overcome challenges, and a deepened sense of connection with others as a result of bearing witness to the resilience and transformation of the people we serve. So as we wrap up today, I would encourage you all to take a couple of minutes to reflect on these questions of knowing the risks of this work, what keeps you in it? And when you experience the harms of this work, what will you do? What is one practice you'll implement in order to manage the effects of this work? And what is the most important thing you want to remember from today? So with that, I know some of you have other meetings to get to, and I want to be respectful of your time. But if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to enter them in the chat. But thank you so much for taking the time to spend the morning with me talking through these really important ideas. Thank you. And Karina, were there any questions that came in? I think a lot of the questions are about resources, but you have been really helpful in getting information to people about. So if there aren't any other questions, go ahead.
I'm getting ready to pull up some conclusion slides that will have all that information.
Great.
I did want to thank you for presenting today. You gave us a wealth of information, and we've had lots of comments. For everyone who is emailing me or I've posted my email if you would like to have copies of the resources. And I actually have updated the slides that I'm getting ready to pull up with some of the resources. And then again, if you email me, I will go ahead and send you the entire list of the references. So this is Susie's contact information, and if you want to take a picture with your phone, you're welcome to do that. I also have included some of the slides that she, or information resources that she touched base on, but again, if you want to email me, I have my email at the top of the page. I can send you the entire list. The presentation, recording, and materials will be available on our website within 30 days. We try to have that to you sooner. Upon exiting the webinar, you will be directed to log on to our website to complete the evaluation. We love to get your feedback. If you have not created a profile, you will need to create a profile in order to complete the evaluation. If you have a profile, you just need to sign on to complete the evaluation. Once you sign on, you will have the evaluation available to you to take. Again, the evaluation closes on Monday, August the 17th. And once you complete the evaluation, you'll get a message just stating that we have received your evaluation. Also, I wanted to state we do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify your attendance and your completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile. And it does take up to 30 days. So again, we do not email that information to you. You will need to check your profile under your professional development, and your CEUs or your certificate of attendance will be posted there. If you want your certificate for reported to CE Broker, please make sure you include your license. And again, Susie, thank you so much for presenting to us today. And we also want to thank and recognize the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. And have a great rest of your day, and please hold for the evaluation. Thank you.